So let us get started here. Everybody knows who I am by now, right? For those who are out there in the audience who do not know, I'm Dr. Charles White. And I've given a series of seminars, one on sexual abuse of kids, one on physical abuse of children, and this one is on emotional abuse of kids. So let's start this by asking you a question. What is the difference between verbally disciplining a child when they haven't behaved properly and emotionally abusing them? What's the difference in those two things? In essence, what it boils down to is that if I discipline one of my children verbally, I will tell them, what you've done is wrong, you know what you've done is wrong. And there's a consequence when you do something wrong. And I'll have them maybe go stand in the corner for 5 minutes or something like that. People who verbally abuse children, and if you go to the first sheet on your page here, it talks briefly about that. All right. What it says is, a person emotionally abusing the child may also reject, criticize, threaten, demean, and berate the child. The vast percentage of the people serving time in our jails and prisons in this country have experienced this. And then you wonder why our population grows so fast in our criminal justice system. That's one of the reasons, as well as being sexually abused and physically abused. Right? The first two, sexually abused and physically abused, are much easier to identify than emotional abuse, because there's no sign on the child. There's no bruises. There's nothing to lean you to believe that child has been abused. It's very, very difficult to diagnose. All right? They also may humiliate your child, engage in name-calling, and insult them. How do you suppose that affects a child? How do you think the child feels if I look at him and say, you aren't worth a damn, you're just a terrible human being?
They don't have any self-worth.
No, eventually, you're exactly right. It erodes their self-esteem, their self-respect, and everything else goes about it. So I want you to take that for a moment and look at some of these people who have committed these horrific crimes in our public schools. They're isolated, they're quiet, they don't associate with anybody else, they more likely have been verbally or sexually or physically abused as a child, and eventually they have to come out of that shell, and when they do, oftentimes people get hurt. So who has to discover that? Who has to look for that? What's the best place to find that in our society? All right. Although an emotionally abused child might not end up in a hospital with a broken bone or concussion, the effects of emotional abuse can be damaging and long-lasting. In 2017, 2.3% of children in the United States experienced psychological and emotional maltreatment, according to a national report. Now, you say 2.3, you say, well, that's not a lot of kids. But if you look at the total population, that's a lot of kids. That's a lot of children.
That's just what's being reported.
Yeah. This estimate is likely low because emotional abuse can be harder to detect than other forms of child abuse and typically takes place in the confines of a child's home. It almost never happens outside the house. Almost never. There might not be any obvious outward signs that the abuse has taken place. Sometimes the child's behavior is the only thing that dictates that there are problems at home. So what kind of behavior would you look for in a child that's been emotionally abused?
Sometimes they're the troublemakers.
Yeah, he could be a troublemaker. It's a child that acts out because he's trying to recover his self-respect and self-esteem. Those types of things. He gets in trouble in school.
Attention getting.
Yes, yeah. Because he has to. There's no other choices left for him. Because when he goes home, this starts all over again. Every day. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a child that has to go home every day and endure this kind of abuse. And then you wonder why they ended up in prison. They're angry. They're angry at the world because the world did nothing to help them. The world ignored them. That's how they end up in trouble. All right? Inappropriate behavior, such as acting very immature or a little bit too mature for their age, can be a sign of abuse, as can dramatic behavioral changes. Normally, he'd be a very pleasant young man. He'd be very easy to get along with, does well in school, very affable, and for the next 2 months, everything falls apart. He gets angry, he abuses other kids in the playground, he does all those things. And if you're a teacher or something, you need to stop him and say, where'd you learn to abuse kids? Where did that come from? And oftentimes, I'll go back what I said before in the earlier one. I said, you get a young child, kindergarten, first or second grade, and ask them that question. They're going to tell you. Children that age don't lie. They just don't. And if they say, well, my dad does this. All right? So when that child now is coming to you and telling you that, you are now, again, their advocate. You stay with that kid no matter what happens, because that child trusts you. You're an important part of that child's life right now. And it goes through the criminal justice system or social services or wherever it may end up. You are that child's advocate. And if little John here has a brother and sisters, and he's acting this way, and he has told you what's going on, it's very likely his 2 siblings are being abused as well. Very likely. And sometimes moms get very upset when the state intervenes in that child's behalf. Because then they take the dad out of the family, or they remove the child from the family. And when I was a case manager for sexual abuse, many times I took the child out of the family. I said, I'm sorry, you can't stay there. Inappropriate behavior, such as acting immature, I did all that, abuse can be dramatic behavioral changes. For example, a child who used to be slightly alive and did not seek attention might suddenly become clingy to a non-abusive adult or compulsively seek affection from others. If you're in a public school system and this little child is always by your desk, that's unusual. That doesn't happen. Now, if you're an uncle or an aunt of one of these children, and that child wants to stay with you, can I spend the night with you, Ann? Can I do that? And he does that over and over and over again. There's a reason why he's doing this. Ask him why. Why? He said, well, I like you. Okay, well, I get that. But there's something else going on here, isn't there? And you got to probe a little bit. You got to ask questions. Okay? Identifying emotional abuse. This is really, really, really important. A child who is being emotionally abused may demonstrate behaviors that can be signs of abuse, including anxiety. They're always nervous, on edge. They never seem to relax. They're afraid to go home. I don't want to go home. You know, I mean, if any child tells a teacher, I don't want to go home, boy, what more do you need? You know, what more do you need? All right? Attempts to avoid certain situations, such as going to an activity or another person's house, because he doesn't know who to trust. Doesn't know. Declining performance at school. Was a great kid, great student, did well, got A's, now he's getting F's and D's. Ask him why. Ask him, why is this happening to you? All right? Delayed emotional development. What's that mean? Somebody tell me what that means. But in most cases, human beings, from the very early beginning, as they mature and grow in life, their emotional response to things changes with them. the more they learn, the more they experience, the more they see, their world changes around them. And that's healthy. That's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. But if you get a child that is say 8 years old and he behaves like a 5-year-old, then you got to ask the question, why is that? Why is it you don't want to emotionally mature with everybody else? All right, depression. We have more cases of depression in this country now than ever reported. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You know, you had the pandemic, you're stuck in your house, your kids are going to school, but they're doing it at home. There's all kinds of demands on the family, and you get overwhelmed, and you say, I just can't do this anymore. And you just emotionally fall apart. That's a lot of responsibility. A lot. All right, desire to hurt themselves or other people on purpose. Because they're being hurt, they're being emotionally hurt every day of their lives, then it's okay for me to hurt other people. That's the way they see it. And sometimes that hurt ends up in a mass shooting at a public school. Sometimes that happens. Here's a good one. Desperately seeks affection from other adults. Why is that child doing that?
They're not getting any from their own parents.
Huh?
They're not getting the affection.
That's exactly right. They're not getting anything at home, at all. So now they're going to compensate. And they have to compensate.
Not in a good way.
Well, I mean, they'll cling to another adult. If they come to you and they just want to be with you all the time, I don't want to go home and everything else, you got to start asking the questions, why don't you want to go home? Developmental regression, for example, bedwetting or soiling after previously mastering bladder and bowel control. Frequent complaints of headaches, stomach aches, and other somatic symptoms with no known cause. Somatic means that it is an emotional response. It is something you have conjured up in yourself to convince yourself you're sick. It's called somatic disorders. About 40% of the American population that goes to a doctor and says, I have this problem, almost 40% of it is somatic. Almost half the population. And the doctor says there's nothing wrong. So she goes out of that office, goes down the street, and sees another doctor. And she keeps seeing doctors until she finally gets one that's going to agree with her. These things are called somatic disorders. And a young child could do that very easily. You know, my self-worth isn't worth anything. I'm a terrible human being. Why should I be alive? I don't deserve to be alive. And you wonder why they go out and commit suicide. Okay? Loss of interest in school activities or other interests. School activities. I mean, when I was growing up, going to the baseball game or football game was a big deal for me. You know, of course I played, so I had to show up. But there are other activities my high school had, and my junior high school had, that I just kind of enjoyed going. That's very normal. That's called socializing with people your age, you know. And a child just doesn't want to do that anymore. I don't want to go. I want to sit here. I'll stay in my room. I'll get on my tablet. I'll find some other way to entertain me other than go out of this house. Now, again, you got to ask the question, why don't you want to go to these things? I'm just not interested. No, come on. You can do better than that. Low self-esteem. I already talked about that. And you can crush a child's self-esteem real quickly. And they'll remember that. They will remember that they got yelled at and screamed at. And imagine every day that happens to them. Every day. And then they grow up to be an adult. And what do they end up doing? They scream at their kids. Because after all, that's how it's done. And nobody breaks that vicious cycle. But somebody has to. Traits of perpetrators. These are the guys that do all, guys and women, the least reported is women. Signs of adult caregivers that might indicate they are abusing children. such as belittling the child in public. They're at the church, they're someplace else, and he starts yelling at his kids in the middle of church or something. I said, sit down, right in the middle of the congregation or something. That's pretty unusual. Openly admitting to disliking or hating the child. I cannot imagine the impact that would have on me if I was young and somebody looked at me and said, I just hate you. Oh my God. I mean, it would just crush me. Applying severe punishments. Any physical punishment on a child that leaves a welt or a burn or something similar to that or a bruise on that child is abusive. There's no way around that. None. And if he comes to school and you see some bruises on him and everything else, ask him. Because the two go hand in hand. Physical abuse and emotional abuse often are tied together. Having unrealistic expectations. Little John's 5 years old and I'm not sure what I mean by unrealistic. How do you define that? Maybe a 3-year-old wants to be an astronaut. Well, it's a little early for that. You know? Or he says things to you that are clearly not even feasible at this moment in his life. All right? He's trying to gather his self-respect back. He wants attention. He wants people to say, see, he is a good guy, isn't he? Look at what he's done. May have a history of violence and aggression or have substance abuse disorders. That's like all the time. These people drink all the time, they take drugs, they do everything else to cover up who they are. And then once you get that high, you can rationalize about what you're going to do, and then they do it. So now we have different types of emotional abuse. Different types. Emotional child abuse can take several forms. At the end of the spectrum are insults or belittling words or actions, while others can be total indifference that causes emotional deprivation. A caregiver who is emotionally abusive often uses words, but their actions can also be abusive. Lack of attention can be abusive. For instance, the family says, I want you to go in your room and you stay there until I tell you to come out. 8 hours later, he's still in his room. He's never come out, hasn't eaten dinner, any of those things we typically do as a family. Right? That's abusive in my opinion. Any adult in a child's life can be emotionally abusive, and the abuse can take many forms. Here are some examples of emotional abuse. A babysitter constantly screams at the kids and makes threats. That's why in a lot of families they use babysitters to come in and take care of the kids. They got cameras. They can record all this stuff. You know, and if it gets bad enough, they'll report it to authorities and never hire this person again. You know? A child is exposed to domestic violence at home. Mom is battered. And you see that frequently too. Mom ends up being a victim of battering. Dad comes home, he's exhausted, he has a few beers, dinner isn't ready, and he slaps you around, everything else. Now get dinner on the table, like I asked you to. And then he turns on the child. All right? A grandparent refuses to interact with the children when they visit and instead watches television. I don't know about you, but I love my grandkids. I love being around my grandkids. You know, they're fun to be with. There's nothing in this world I wouldn't do for my grandkids. I cannot imagine somebody coming into my home, sitting down, turns on the TV and absolutely ignores their grandchildren. Although they were coming to them, go over there, I'm watching television. And just shove them away. Now Grandma and Grandpa doesn't like me either. So who do I have left? do I have left? A parent with alcohol use disorder gets angry when they drink, often yelling and screaming all night. That's all the big umbrella of domestic violence. That's all they do. Go out and drink and yell. And the child sits in this room and listens to this day after day after day after day. A step-parent says they wish a child didn't exist. I can imagine how crushing that can be to a kid, to a young child. I wish you were never born. Man, from that on, everything goes downhill from there. Everything. A teacher makes fun of a child in front of the class when they struggle to read aloud. When I was a kid in junior high school, and that's back when we had junior high schools, so we didn't have middle schools. I don't know why we made that transition. I've often wondered about that. The teachers, if you didn't behave back then, and I remember an incident, I'm sitting in this classroom, it's a math class, and the teacher, I never forgot the teacher's name. His name was Johnston. And I'm sitting in the middle of the class, so I take this piece of paper and I develop a very nice, fancy airplane. And a friend of mine sitting in the front row. So I'm waiting, and I said, well, I'll just toss it. So I toss the plane towards my friend. Well, he bends down to tie his shoe. This plane sails right over his head and lands on the teacher's desk. And the teacher looks out and I'm like busted, you know. Mr. White, you want to come up here for a moment, please? And it was always very formal. Call you Mr. Come up here. And he said, you got two choices, either 4 nights after school or 3 swats. I said, well, I'll take the swats. I'll spend 4 nights after school. So he takes out his paddle, and you bend over, and he swats you 4 times. And you didn't dare show any reaction to that. That was out of the question. So you're walking back to my seat, and I'm saying, nothing to that. Where inside I'm going, oh my God, that hurt. You know? That's a good example of this. You know, but back then, that only happened once. I got the word. Yes, sir. Never again. After a divorce, a parent asks the child to lie to a judge about the other parent to ensure that they will gain full custody. Risk factors for emotional abuse. When it comes to abusive behaviors, there are several risk factors that increase the likelihood that a person may engage in emotional abuse of a child. These are, but not limited to, the following: having a physical or mental illness such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or depression. Now, that's a self-explaining, I think. Dealing with financial stress, unemployment, or poverty. When you're in poverty, you have no money, you haven't got anything to buy food with. It's just, you know, you get angry at the world because nobody's there to help you, and you take all that anger out on your kids. Being socially isolated or separated from extended family. That's a big one, I think. So being away from extended family is really important because that's often your ability to talk to them if you got a problem. Go talk to dad, or go talk to mom, or Uncle Ed, or your grandparents and people. You know, my grandkids will come to me oftentimes and say, you know, Papa, I got a question, and they'll ask me. And I'll tell them. You know, I gain that trust in my grandkids. And I think that's important, that every grandparent does that. Raising a child that is developmentally or physically disabled, that is huge. I mean, it takes virtually all your time. It just does. It's such a challenge for a parent. Using alcohol or drugs, that's self-explanatory. Lacking parenting skills or understanding of child development. They don't understand how children grow and mature in life. Why? Because he's an electrician. That's what he knows. Or he's a plumber. Or he's a doctor. That's what he knows. He knows nothing about the steps of emotional and physical growth in children. Experiencing a family crisis or family stress, such as domestic abuse or marital conflicts. That should be self-explanatory what that means. I'm sure we all know that. Desiring to control a child by using words or actions. What's that mean? Desiring to control a child using words or actions. What actions would you do to control a child?
Give them the evil eye.
Evil eye. Or maybe a control mechanism would be that if you don't do what I tell you to do,
Threats.
I'm going to hurt you.
Yeah.
I'm going to hurt you if you don't do exactly what I tell you to do. That could be one. There could be all kinds of them. And oftentimes the guy, the abuser that's telling this child that, has led a very isolated life himself or herself. So who do you blame here? Who do you blame? That's tough. It's easy to point a finger. Remember that. Easy to point a finger at somebody else and say that person's wrong until you understand that person and where she or he came from and what has happened in their life. I always made a conscious effort to do that. All right? Impact of emotional abuse. The consequences of child abuse in any form can be severe and can persist into adulthood. A child often believes that they are responsible for the abuse and that it means they are unloved, unlovable, or unwanted. There are some of the long-term effects of emotional abuse. And I saw that really a lot in sexual abuse. The children will often blame themselves. What did I do to make him do this to me? What did I do wrong? And they carry that with them virtually all their lives. And then they wonder why they can't have a warm, caring, affectionate relationship with another human being. They have attachment issues. Always with you. Doesn't want to leave. Doesn't want to go home. Peer relations. Doesn't get along with kids. Never does. He acts out against them. Fights with them all the time. That type of thing. Yells at the teacher. So on and so forth. Trouble with intimacy. That's a big one. Relational aggressions. Gets angry with people around her. Doesn't want to be with her family. Behavioral and social problems such as delinquency and sexually aggressive behavior in young adults. There's a big difference between sexual aggressiveness between males and females. Repeating the cycle of abuse will go from one generation to the next, and it just goes on and on and on and on and on and never ends until somebody sits them down and says, enough. You need to talk to me. We can't do this anymore. Suicide and mental illness. Suicide's a big one. Once that child's self-esteem has been eroded and destroyed and nobody cares, nobody's paying any attention to him, his self-worth is in the tank, he says to himself, so what's the point in living? Why am I even here? And he thinks he's better off dead than he would be alive. Okay? I hope you learned something. Any questions at all? Anyone at all? Anyway, thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed this series.
Yes.
You go home being better prepared.